Welcome to the Regeneration Collective podcast, the next UN Visions for a Regenerative Future. I'm Silke von Brockhausen, a UN insider with 18 years across more than a dozen UN missions and founder of the Regeneration Collective. As the UN approaches its 80th year and the campaign for the next Secretary General gets underway, amid protracted conflicts, widening inequalities, and cross-planetary boundaries, we ask, how can the UN become the platform through which people, institutions, and the more than human world repair and transform broken systems and create conditions where life can thrive? In each episode, we speak with regenerative practitioners, policy shapers, indigenous knowledge holders, peace builders, culture makers, and frontline humanitarians about the lived experiences and visions that could translate into regenerative UN policies, organizational culture, and operations. This is for UN staff, partners, member states, and bridge builders who are curious about what regeneration means in practice and who are ready to turn the UN into a trailblazer for this shift. And at this episode, I would like to welcome Joachim Stroh, who works at the sweet spot where people, purpose, and practical tools come together. With a background in business and technology, he takes complex systems and makes them understandable so real people can do real work together, building bridges to connect the two. Joachim has led large knowledge sharing and collaboration efforts in global firms and peer networks, focusing on both technology and human-centric decision-making. After a long corporate career in HR consulting, he co-founded Change Agents Worldwide, Seniors Knowledge Expeditions, and since 2019, Hypha, helping communities and institutions pilot new, transparent ways of working that distribute authority and reward participation. His North Star: tools should amplify trust, creativity, and care, helping us build organizations that regenerate life rather than drain it. Welcome to the podcast, Joachim.
Thank you so much, Silke. Happy to have this invitation and looking forward to our conversation here.
Wonderful. Same here. So let me start with the same question I have for all of my podcast guests. What does regeneration mean to you, and why does it matter right now?
Yes, great question. So for me, obviously, regeneration is moving beyond the stage of, doing less harm and moving into something which is more life. It's moving from extractive, sustainable to more restorative, more regenerative. I think life-affirming practices, that's at the heart of this for me. It's mapping our territory now. We understand what the pathways are. But it also means that we're starting to design new kinds of organizations, new kinds of institutions, new circular type economies, that lead to more thriving cultures. So it's really different ways, different pathways to actively restore ecosystems, relationships that we're building, and most importantly, the trust among us, right? So if you look around us, right, amid, the collapse around us, the war, the institutional critiques, I think regeneration cannot be optional anymore. We need to take action. And that for me is the second part of how I would define regeneration. This is really the call to action. It's asking the question, how can we regrow, each one of us really regrow conditions for life, right? It's the difference for me between sort of repairing a broken machine and then cultivating a living and breathing forest. It's for me the bridges we can build between the two. And I want to point to one video that probably all of you saw from Jeff Bridges, right? Talking about bridges. So Jeff Bridges said clearly, as a narrator of, we are the regeneration, right? Now it's up to us to say, what are we going to do in this regeneration, the generation that follows, and the generation after generation that comes after that? What are we going to do in our current environment and situation? So that's how I would define that for you.
Beautiful. And in our previous conversation, I could sense that you're actually truly living your values and that you're putting all of this behind Hypha technology. And that's why I was so intrigued to talk with you about what kind of technologies we can have to get from this fighting fire operational mode we have at the UN also to help really create these conditions for life. Maybe you can tell us how Hypha technology shifted in this way. What changed mindsets, agreements, and practice in your organization, or maybe in those you've worked with? Tell us a story, please.
For sure, stories. I love stories. We'll stick more with stories later on. So at Hypha, we've been doing the journey now for over 7 years. We started actually to create a regenerative currency. It was called Seeds at that time. A currency that helped villages, permaculture groups to create circular economies in smaller spaces. For that, we needed to get organized, right? So there were a lot of tasks, a lot of activities around us, and we wanted to see how we can best organize ourselves. When I joined Hypha, that was the beginning of sort of a new story, a new chapter on the internet. I will get into that in a bit. But it opened up sort of new possibilities, new ways of working. So instead of chasing performance, in organizations or power plays in organizations, you can create the conditions now for trust and for flow, right? So we did that by creating a highly sort of collaborative, engaging organization. And something, came up at that time, which was blockchain technology or Web3 technology. But we'll get into that. I just wanted to point out, that we were able to start making collective agreements. We're not building another traditional startup in that space, but rather a space that is highly participatory, right? There was no CEO in all the 7 years. We made our decisions, thousands of those, really using the Hypha platform, and came, to where we are today. We went through iterations, through beta programs, and now to a state where we want to launch it to the world. And really we did this by starting to sort of listen to each other. To a lot more sense making in our context of work. It's a seek, sense, respond reaction. If you live in and breathe in more complex environments. And then suddenly we experience this energy shift, right? So from scarcity, controlling things to more of an abundant thing, and start really asking what does the system need? What does the environment need from us? And from that point of view, from that vantage point, I think a lot changed. And it's been a beautiful journey. I enjoyed it for all those years. And we haven't even started yet. We haven't even tapped what's possible with the kind of technology that's coming.
Well, I'm excited to learn more about it. And for me, it's already a miracle that I even managed to host this podcast and do all the technology on my own. And for that reason, I would also like to ask you to explain to us, maybe less tech savvy listeners and this podcast host, what exactly is this mysterious Web 3.0 that we hear about so much? Can you explain that to us? And maybe also, what is the blockchain and what is a DAO? Over to you.
Sure. So let me get you on a small tour of the internet. We're all familiar with Tim Berners-Lee and his first iteration of Web 1.0, I would call it. The first static websites, the first sites you can build with raw HTML. I'm sure some of your listeners have experience with that. So it was the ability to express ourselves in the world, through simple sites, simple HTML. Suddenly you could put up your blog, your website, and share your knowledge, right? It was a lot of fun. It was really also very decentralized. Nobody stepped in and said, stop it, can't do this. Or no centralized organizations came in and started to control the web. That happened in Web 2, right? So Web 2 gave us the platforms that connect us, yes, but it also became very extractive, very centralized, right? Your data is not yours anymore. You hand it over to the big parties out there. But funnily, enough, on the internet, every 20, 25, 30 years, there's a big paradigm shift happening. So we're moving from, a Web 1, highly decentralized, to a Web 2, highly centralized and extractive, back to what I believe is Web 3, which is now sort of reclaiming our agency, right? Starting to get back into, well, it's about peer-to-peer coordination. It's about shared ownership. It's about us coming together, solving the real hard problems. And for Web3 to actually exist, it needed a new sort of infrastructure component. And that's what's called blockchain technology. So blockchain is simply said, it's a shared ledger. Think about a financial ledger for every organization in silos. Now suddenly there's a globally shared ledger where we can all record our transactions, more so our activities, on this ledger, and make that available to anyone so they can dive into the ledger and see, oh, this organization is focusing on this stuff. This organization is doing very interesting voting methods and ways of participatory governance. Let's look into that stuff. So the idea with Web3 is really to say, yes, there's new infrastructure, but let's not focus on the technology too much, right? Focus on what we can do with it. And that's what we're starting to see now, new ways of building sort of an interface layer, user interface, experience layer on top of that to say, whoa, there's so much more possible. And this is where, we looked at decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, as you mentioned. It was like the first stage of these Web3 applications that you're able to build. But we stepped soon beyond DAOs, because DAOs are still very early on. The idea of early DAOs was, yes, decentralized, that's good. Autonomous, that's great too. And kind of organizations, that's good. But they were meant to build more trustless environments. A lot of, processing of rules, they're called smart contracts in the Web3 space. So automatic execution, right? So you don't need to trust the system anymore and just come in. We said this cannot happen in sort of this new open, more decentralized space. We want to bring the humans back into that space. And that's what we called ours initially DHO, decentralized human organization, or decentralized human organism, to move deeper into the idea of biomimetic designs, right? And open that up to a more restorative and a more regenerative space. So DHOs was the label we gave it, but then also thought, well, that can go even further, right? Let's think about what else is this technology capable of. And I can get into some details later, what actual features look like and what people are doing in these spaces. But for me, this became a concept of realizing a truly adaptable organization. It's human first. It's us sitting in these spaces. It's us, making the decisions after, as I said, sense making is critical here. Listening to each other is critical. The decision process then really to say, okay, we made that decision, we record it on the blockchain, right? So blockchain is, you can see this as a ledger and also as a kind of a database, right? So where things are recorded publicly, and they're there forever. As long as the blockchain exists, that will sit, and people can retrieve that information. That's the beauty of it. It's immutable, you can't crack it, it's highly secured. So these are well-rounded and safe decisions you're making there. But again, it's for me at the end of the decision process, right? So you've done the work, you understand each other, you build the trust, right, into the organization. And that for me is the idea of an adaptable organization. So organizations that really are prepared for this new paradigm shift. So it's going beyond just, having a well-defined, optimized, performance-driven organization. We need to be able to say, what are the capacities to respond to our environment? There's so much change going around us. Adaptable means we can adapt to what? We can adapt to changes around us. And this is why we built our platform. It's built on a few simple building blocks, like a space where you invite people into the space. You come together, you propose ideas, and you decide on these ideas. That's really it. And then you can replicate that idea and say, okay, how deep does it go into an organization? You can have a space inside a space inside a space. Or you can go the other direction and say, hey, it's a space is part of something bigger. Space is part of a coalition of spaces. It's part of an ecosystem that you're building. It's part of the wider network that you're building. So I believe sort of that's the formula for how do you see emergence coming out of a complex network. Simple building blocks that we're building and providing with the platform, and then you're able to connect, right? That's the last thing I wanted to bring across. It's this focus on interconnectivity, right? It's the solutions we build together that is so critical here. So it's you and me, not you against me or sitting in my own silo and competing with others. It's really coming together, solving the problem, seeing who's here in what capacity, and then address that to these new kind of technologies that are now becoming available. And then maybe one more thing is you can even go beyond adaptable organizations. And I think that's where it gets interesting for you, for your audience out there. I see the same happening for adaptable institutions. Bringing that level of adaptability into scale, right? And saying, well, what we're trying to experiment now on a smaller scale with these smaller organizations. And by the way, organization can be anything. It can be a village somewhere. We're experimenting with energy communities in Europe. It can be eco villages somewhere in Central America that are sprouting up. It can be companies or startups, right? So anything can be an organization. But the concept of adaptable organizations can now be extended, I think, through adaptable institutions, bringing that into scale and then into bodies like United Nations that are able to sort of run these experiments. And we can get into some ideas, I think, a bit later, what's possible, what we think is possible in these spaces. But for now, let me pause my tour.
That's a lot to unpack there, especially for a newcomer like me to this whole technology. I still haven't quite figured out how blockchain creates trust. Because it looks like it's a technology that is encrypted and the users are staying anonymous in a way. But at the same time, it's very transparent, so you can trace which user has said what and done what. Is that correct? How I'm reading it?
Yes, that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
So for us, if people come to Hypha and our own organization, and we have about 300 of those organizations out there, you immediately sense something is different. Not only because it's not strictly hierarchical, right? So you're not invited and sit at your desk in one of the boxes of the organizational hierarchy, right? You're part of this living, breathing thing, a structure that can change very quickly and respond to the environment. But you're inside this, what we call spaces, right? And you get to know the members of the spaces. And we're trying to limit these spaces in size. So there's the Dunbar number, right? So don't go beyond 100, 140 people, because then you lose the connections. You lose the trust is starting to become, a bit feral, and you want to still maintain the relationships. But once you do that, once you have these spaces and you see that others are coming on board and they are starting to participate in ways, you establish a different way of looking at people and looking at the organization. You're part of this now. And that's the level of trust that's, to me, not possible in traditional organizations. As you said in the intro, I know I've been working for 15 years in the corporate world where, you are some small part of a larger thing, and you really don't grasp what is going on. That's different in these new kinds of adaptable organizations, because you can participate, you can voice concerns, you can actually earn your voice over time. So maybe a little bit detour about how do you build this trust with the technology. So there are different voting methods. How do you come together and say, this is a great idea, this is a good choice, this is a good strategy, let's move ahead with that? Every space that we create can have its own voting method. So right now, in our current version, we allow 3 different methods. They can be based on the tokens you're holding. They can be based on one member, one vote. So we don't care how long you were there, equal participation for everyone. Or, and this is what we've invented early on, is you could earn your voice tokens. Nobody can buy voice tokens. You really have to participate. And every time you contribute to the organization, you earn these voice tokens. And with that, your decision power goes up, and people see that you've been long in the institution and the organization, and can do more, right? So they're starting to listen to you more. But conversely, it also goes down, right? So if you're not participating any longer, there's a decay rate built right into the system. So over time, you lose the voice, right? And then you can come back and rebuild the voice. So it's very sort of dynamic, how things are changing and how you build it together.
Thanks so much for explaining it clearer to me, coming from the outside. I would like to maybe get a sense of what that would mean for an organization like the UN, which is very hierarchical, very centralized, very bureaucratic, and it's still operating a lot based on old ways of working, and about also controlling more about what the colleagues are doing, because we also need data and report about what's happening. We have an accountability towards the public, or the member states. And in that case, for me, this is a whole new way of operating, in a way where everybody has the same vote, the same kind of hierarchical position, and is more involved in all the decisions. And it's all much more much more agency back to the individual staff, less control from their superiors, and more collaboration. So it's exactly actually what regenerative leadership needs. So these tools would be amazing to support a regenerative approach in an organization. So let's imagine the UN would decide to move into a decentralized human organism, as you called it earlier, I believe. How do we foster the kind of mindset and culture needed inside an organization to embrace this? Because it's a lot about letting go.
Yes, yes. First of all, that would be an incredible journey to go on. And I think we already started the process. We're seeing that it's necessary to move deeper into regeneration, as we said at the beginning. And for me, we also have to start rethinking our institutions and rethinking the culture inside the institutions. Because if you just put in technology, it's just going to amplify what's already there. A fractured culture will fracture more. Technology would just scale that more and more. But if we focus on the culture, right, to build sort of more coherence, more trust in the system, that's a much better starting point. So I would say, you can start with a shared purpose of some small mission, right? I mean, if you look at the UN, right? So take one slice, and create a window of innovation, for maybe a specific country office. You can take a look at peacekeeping, conflict resolution is a good one, or sustainable development. Just pick one slice, and then you can launch a sandbox. Create a new governance template to say, hey, let's try this out in this sandbox, in this space, invite a few people, and then run it through 2 or 3, decision cycles. Once you do this, people will immediately feel like, what's the difference? Because it's hard to explain. You can see if I'm explaining this technology, it really gets stuck somewhere, right? It's not easy. But once you experience it, and that's the beauty of it, once you're in there yourself, right? You're in there and see the others. You're in there to see these proposals that are coming up, and you're starting to vote on proposals or voice concerns and resolve these conflicts within the group. You suddenly see how that all works together. So run it a few decision cycles, and then you can publish what you learned, and then you iterate. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think maybe we can go a little bit more specific. One of the biggest tasks of the UN in countries after conflict is to rebuild and then find the relevant financing to support this rebuilding in collaboration with the civil society authorities on the ground, member states, donors, etc. And it's usually a very complex task where you're trying to get up to 30 different UN organizations that are active in these countries on one table, on one page, and then also address all the different stakeholders' opinions. How could this sandbox that you were talking about, this tool, how could it help us in coming to a joint project, plan, and then implement it?
Yes. So let's get a little bit deeper, go down to, a way of introducing that to the people in the field offices, in these projects. For me, let's break it down into a couple of, changes that I think are possible. One is, I mentioned collective decision making. So instead of a few people making decisions behind closed doors, right, where you don't know who has a stake in what, why don't you make that a bit more open, where everyone has a stake, can see these proposals, start to deliberate, and then vote on this. So that introduces a level of transparency that you can still contain in the space, right? Contain inside a window of one of the missions. But just this simple step, for people to see there's now a proposal out there that we collectively created, right? And we collectively decided on that. And it brought so much transparency and ideas into this whole decision-making process that you will see it really changes the way you work and it changes the way you do things. Second thing I would introduce is contribution accounting. So one of the things that DAOs early on introduced is a way of let me go back to traditional organizations, right? You have your official job title, you have your definition of the work you do, and you go run with it. With a contribution accounting system, it means that you can have all kinds of contributions. So someone facilitates, some dialogue, someone designs some graphic, someone coordinates some logistical things, happening in the country office. These are all contributions to the institution. Why not rewarding these? Why not recognizing that everybody has contributed in some way? And that can be then converted into, well, the voice tokens I mentioned. There are other types of tokens that we can use, and including sort of the payout tokens. That's sort of the closest to fiat currency that you have inside the DAO and AO space. But it extends, the way how people can actually see their role inside an organization. So one more thing about the tokens, because that's one of the topics that always comes up and say, I don't understand what these tokens are. Everybody talks about tokens. And there has been so much, political issues here in the US and around the globe with, scams in the token world, and what's this Bitcoin stuff, going up and down, is so volatile, but again, what Web3 gave us is just the option to create these tokens, and you decide what you do with these tokens. The UN could have a UN utility token representing the utility it provides, when running these projects. The reputation of people joining in and participating in that. The voice people create and have on the ground. These are all kinds of tokens. It's just another way of expressing what activities are there, what assets are there, and what do you do with all of this. So that's another way, I think, of bringing that into the UN. Just experiment with a little bit with these tokens, see where's utility, see how can that be used, where's voice, where's regular, more fiat-based currency involved in paying for projects.
I love that idea, because a lot of our work is really around localizing our projects and really including the voices of the affected populations in our plans and consultations in a very meaningful way, and not just check the box, but really include them in the whole process. And I feel like this might be a great solution to give them a meaningful voice. And through the token system, they could then be more motivated to join any kind of online consultations or so that's happening, and really see how their voices are being valued and listened to in those consultations we are having on the ground. If I understand the system correct, and that could be really groundbreaking, and it could be this kind of bridge we need between our UN operations and then actually the populations on the ground, and have more meaningful interactions with them. So thanks for this example, but feel free to give us more concrete examples that you have already maybe experienced through Hypha that could be relevant for the UN.
Sure. I mean, this was only talking about now what can you do inside the institution, and how can you motivate, employees and people working in participatory ways and engaging. So all about engagement. But what's also very important for me is what happens outside the UN. How do you interface with these different programs that you have there? So take the UN development program, in some rural village. Traditionally, there are funds coming in, they're trickling through the bureaucracy, and then somewhere end up very much like a black box concept. But imagine these kind of funds are now tokenized, so you can just simply create tokens instead of the funds that are coming in, and then you can disperse them into these different spaces. So these rural villages actually can also have a representation inside the system, right? So they can have a space, they can have stakeholders in this space, they have village elders, right? They have different kind of stakeholders that want to make a decision, right? Now suddenly you can interface between the United Nations as an institutional and as a space that tries something new with a rural village somewhere on the countryside, somewhere in a critical environment there. And then you can tie that to sort of more effective flows. We call these value flows. How do you route this into another word for that is a financial irrigation system? So the funds really end up in the right places, and they sustain growth, right? They maintain something that's so transparent and so visible that you cannot do with traditional, funding and distribution. And then you can look, who else is here, other local contributors, you can make that visible. You can see what the impact is in real time. And you can even create some kind of a fishbowl setting, right? So there are other people looking over your shoulder. You can invite, say, schools learning from this project, right? And participate in some ways in what's going on the ground. There's so much possibility if you see this as an interconnected space, right? It's not just one block sitting over here and we're distributing and dispersing this stuff. Well, it's us together again. It's different spaces suddenly connecting with each other, and we're learning from each other. And that's how you build trust, and that's how you solve the real hard problems, I believe.
I love these ideas, and I see a lot of potential for these technologies, exactly for these use cases that you have described. And I know that also across the UN, there are already some prototypes happening that use local currencies, like you described, and are setting up these kind of spaces in communities. I also know there are a lot of critics. I mean, some say like the technology can also be extractive and exploitive. When it comes with the wrong intention from the wrong angle, and it might be used to maybe hook communities more to technology in the interest of banks or whatever it could be. There are also critics that say that we don't have time for learning a new technology and that would just add on my workload. And I also personally, for me, it is the fear that if we don't do our inner work and become more collaborative and more transparent ourselves in a way, and open ourselves up for more trust and other areas where we might need to work on ourselves, using these technologies will just lead to the same problems we had before, because the user itself, us, UN staff, for example, haven't changed. Can you say anything to these three maybe more critical perspectives on Web 3.0, DAO, blockchain, etc.?
Sure. So the question is really what gets in the way? Yes, there's technology, but there is legacy power dynamics, right? Hidden dynamics embedded in any hierarchical structure. That's just not institutions, that's organizations, that's companies that are not ready to try these new experiments or revisit what's possible. It's the fear of losing control. Procedures, there are protocols that have been developed for ages, and deviating from these protocols is really difficult. It's a hard thing to do. What we're promoting with the platform we're building is, well, there are different kinds of protocols you can introduce. They can work hand in hand with existing protocols. So say there's a governance protocol you can introduce. Why not making a decision in this new way and see what happens? There are protocols for membership. How do you bring people of the institution into these spaces? How do you make sure we have the right people and the right expertise in these spaces? And then, of course, there are regenerative protocols. What does it mean to activate something regenerative inside the institution? So you can list that, and we're building those as templates, right? So you can replicate those and go ahead and do something with it. One point I think you're coming at is a really important one. It's this inner alignment. You want to create an institution that is more in coherence. How do you even do that, right? So think about
big question.
Level of coherence. We've talked about coherence a lot inside the organization, inside these different pilots that we were running, right? Because it's so critical. If you have a misaligned, incoherent organization, you don't get anything done. So that inner alignment is really critical. And that means focusing on the individual in organizations, and it focuses also on sort of the collective. Why are we here? What's our purpose? What's our mission, right? And why is that so important for the UN? It's because, and that's when I want to come back to the stories, the millions of stories that are happening on the ground, people suffering in these regions, right? And then you can step in and say, well, there are some solutions, and we want to bring these stories across and see what solutions out there. So bringing sort of the joy back into the lives of so many people and so many communities out there. And to do that, you need an inner alignment. You need to have really coherent way of seeing how we can embrace that and how we can go into these critical spaces and tell these stories, right? And I think the UN is perfectly prepared for that. They've been a story machine for so long. And I think these stories become more intense now, and they want to be more shared. They want to be more open, and people are looking for other ways of now diving into these on the ground, becoming more participatory, inviting more people to see what's possible, and then solve that again together, right? So not as an isolated, group coming in, but together with others. That's what I see as a possibility here.
I love this future vision of a decentralized, more connected UN also. Now to the final part of our conversation, a question I ask everybody in light of the ongoing campaign for the new Secretary General who will start on the 1st of January 2027. If it was you, Joachim, what would you do in your first 100 days in office to turn things around and transform the UN into a life-affirming organization?
That's great. Imagine nomination process points to me suddenly. Say, hey, you're a candidate. Why not? So yeah, what would I do as a UN Secretary General? For me, I'd start piloting these kind of the idea of adaptable institutions, right? Creating these new kind of participatory spaces across the UN system, right? Again, it could be small regenerative circles, teams, pilots, you name it, that go on a mission, right? Instead of a predefined, pathway of this is how we go into a country, this is how we install change. No, just try something small, agile enough to see what are the results. So the outcomes coming in faster, right? So that's the first thing. Second thing, I would really focus on sort of these inner development programs, really for staff to prepare them to start sharing these stories, because these stories can be they can be brutal, they can be difficult to explain, they can be hard to participate in. So I think give them the necessary strength, right, to pull through and bring these stories to life, and then lastly, maybe, the big, mission and connection that the UN did through the Sustainable Development Goals, made a big headway, I think, into, yes, bring that to other groups, take these goals and do something with it, right? For me, I want to see these goals moving away from the static thing to becoming more of a bridge into much more regenerative pathways. You and I know how these regenerative pathways can look like. We've seen examples, and we want to bring that into an institutions like the UN. So these SDGs are not these funny, colorful blocks people sit on, right? But they are circles. They are balls. You play with them, right? You introduce them in different ways and see what's possible. I think loosening up that framework would be another of my things I would do as UN Secretary General.
Great practical ideas for whoever will take over the office, and maybe it will be you. You have my vote. And then I would also like to hear from you. Do you have any advice for a regenerative daily practice that any UN staff or whoever is listening now can start doing to become maybe more coherent inside, aligned with these vision that we were talking about?
Yes, yeah. So I would start with meetings, right? So meetings is always a good starting point. Look at your meetings you have today. Look at your next meeting that's coming up. And then instead of going through the agenda, start differently. Start with point to one thing you can stop doing right now that's more draining, that's more extractive, and point on one thing that would regenerate trust. And that could be regenerate trust inside the group of people you have there in the meeting. Or it could be the project you're working on. How can we ensure there is trust embedded in this? What are some ideas here? So just, try something new in a meeting. Go out and
Love that idea.
that would be my advice.
Great tip. I'm very outside the box. And lastly, how can people work with you, with Hypha? How can they get in touch if they are now really ready to jump on the DAO, blockchain, DHO bandwagon? What can they do?
Yeah, it's two things. I mentioned, yes, you can learn about it, you can read about it, you can visit our website. It's at hypha.earth. Notice we're not .com or .org, we're .earth. So
We put it
Hypha,
in the show notes.
Hypha, by the way, stands for mycelium in the soil, right? So that's the connective tissue, the invisible tissue in the ground that we're building here as the infrastructure that's necessary. And then you have the trees and the bushes sprouting up out of this. So you can go to the website and learn about it. But the important part starts really with experiencing it yourself. Right? So see how this works. You can take a look at our network. Again, it's transparent, so you can look at the organizations that we're just starting to reboot. You will see a few of them who are, just starting to set up their own space. You can see their purpose. You can see what they're doing. You can see Hypha in this space too, because we're just another player. We happen to create the platform, yes, but there's so many others, in socio-political, socio-ecological spaces that create their own vision, right? And they own their vision, right? It's theirs. We're not controlling that. We're not centralized or extractive. So I would invite people to take a look what's there, see what's possible, and then maybe launch your first mission, on the platform. Who knows?
Sounds exciting. Joachim, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. I learned so much, and I hope our listeners too. And let's stay connected and hopefully collaborate in the future.
Thank you so much, Silke. That was great.